Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Senate Democratic Caucus. I'm Allison Clarkson. I am honored to be the majority leader of the Senate Democrats. And today we have a special presentation by our new fiscal analyst at Joint Fiscal. He comes to us from Philadelphia. More on that at another time. But where he worked with the deputy mayor and became a whiz on pensions and transportation issues. So many of our senators have gotten to know him in transportation. But today we're going to ask him to address his expertise to our pension challenge that we face. And to tee that up, I give you none other than our own divine President Pro Tem, Senator Ballant.
So thank you, Chris, for joining us today. I found it very helpful to be able to speak with Mr. Roop from Joint Fiscal over the last couple of weeks through emails, through phone calls. He did a presentation for me with a slide deck last week to help me understand more fully the pension situation that we find ourselves in. As many of you already know, within the caucus, and we have a guest member from our Republican caucus today, Senator Westman's joining us to listen in. We know that this issue is not a new issue. It dates back 4 governors. There are multiple reasons why we find ourselves in the precarious financial situation that we're in right now. This is a very deeply personal issue for so many Vermonters, for so many of us within the caucus who care deeply about our public employees and of course, our great teaching staff in all of our towns. And so today we're really looking at the mechanics of all the different factors that led up to the situation that we find ourselves in. Chris is very good about taking very complicated information and making it more digestible, especially for those of us who are not actuaries. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris. And if there are questions that we don't have time for at the end, I know he is fantastic about circling back around with any additional questions that you may have. So thanks, Mr. Roop. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator Ballant and Senator Clarkson, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. For the record, my name is Chris Roop, and I'm a fiscal analyst with the Joint Fiscal Office. So today I'm going to provide a brief overview of the challenges facing the pension systems and the contributing factors behind those. I'm going to share my screen right now. And this is a relatively short slide deck. It's only about 12 slides, but I wanted to make sure in our limited time together that we had the opportunity to sort of level set and give everybody the high level overview, and then leave some time for questions to get a little bit further into the weeds. So I'm going to preface this like I do with every presentation with the disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer, actuary, or an investment professional in real life or on Zoom. But prior to moving to Vermont a few months ago and joining JFO, I worked for the city of Philadelphia, and one of my duties was serving as our city manager's voting trustee on the city pension board. So I know a little bit about how large defined benefit pension systems like Vermont's work in practice. So let's start off with just a real quick overview of how the pension systems are governed. The state's 3 major pension systems each have a board of trustees, and they're all set according to statute. Their memberships vary slightly, but the overall theme is that employee representatives play a really significant role in the decision-making process. The 3 boards of trustees along the right side of the slide are tasked with the general administration and operation of the retirement systems, and they adopt various actuarial recommendations. The trustee boards also play a role with choosing members to serve on VPIC, the Vermont Pension Investment Committee. VPIC oversees the investments and the management of the plan assets. The treasurer serves on all of these boards, and all of them currently must agree to changes to the assumed rate of return in order for any changes to take effect. But the key takeaway here is that at all levels, members of the retirement system sit at the decision-making tables and play a very significant role in the governance of the retirement systems. So why are we talking about pensions? This slide summarizes the immediate issue at hand. Both the state employee and teacher pension systems are facing significant and growing unfunded liabilities. And as a reminder, the unfunded liability represents the gap between the value of the plan assets and the expected cost of the retirement benefits that have been earned by the active and retired workforce. So right now, VSERS is only 66.4% funded, and the teacher pension is 51.3% funded. The unfunded liability across these two systems is almost $3 billion, and that gap will ultimately need to be closed by the end of the amortization period in 2038. Most recently, the unfunded liabilities have increased by approximately $604 million from FY21 to FY22. And that increase caused the employer's required annual payment to the pension systems, called the ADAC, to increase by roughly $96 million. And again, that's just from one year to the next, a $96 million increase. And as a reminder, that ADAC payment is the amount that the employer must pay in every year to fully fund the normal cost, plus make a payment toward the unfunded liability. So when the unfunded liability gets bigger, the ADAC payment gets bigger too. It works almost like a credit card. The balance on your card is the unfunded liability, and the ADAC is the amount you need to pay down that balance with interest. And these amounts are recalculated every year. So why did these numbers go up so much? It was due to a combination of factors. Economic assumptions were revised, including lowering the assumed rate of return from 7.5 to 7%. Demographic assumptions were also revised. And these revisions were prompted by the fact that in recent years, demographic and economic experience has deviated quite a bit from assumptions, and the assumptions for the future have changed. In other words, we did not consistently earn the investment return we thought we would in the past, and the future investment outlook looks a little less rosy than it looked in the past. The behavior of the workforce also differed from what was previously assumed, and forward-looking assumptions were revised to hopefully be more realistic going forward. So in the bigger picture, the state's long-term retirement liabilities have more than doubled since the current amortization period began in 2008. Right now, the total unfunded retirement liabilities, including pensions and OPEB or other post-employment benefits, that's subsidized retiree health care, they amount to more than $5.6 billion, or approximately $9,100 per Vermonter. Pension liabilities alone have increased more than sixfold, from $700 per Vermonter in 2008 to $4,800 per Vermonter today. And the subsidized retiree health care, or OPEB, which we currently do not pre-fund, adds another $4,300 per Vermonter of unfunded liability to the state's balance sheet. The rating agencies look at factors like this when analyzing and determining state credit ratings, and these unfunded liabilities are not trending in a positive direction. So as these unfunded liabilities have grown, they have added stress to the budget. The unfunded pension liability must ultimately be paid off, and it has grown much faster than the overall payroll or size of the active workforce. As a result, costs related to pensions are eating a larger slice of the budget pie. In total, our retirement liabilities consume more than 13 cents of every general fund dollar, up from 10.5 cents just 4 years ago. Pension costs now consume almost $200 million, more than 10% of the general fund, and OPEB consumes an additional $50 million. Most of the general fund impact is related to the teacher retirement systems because the general fund pays for the teacher OPEB and the unfunded teacher pension liability. VSERS retirement costs are allocated to the various funds that employ the active workforce. So only about 40% of the VSERS cost hits the general fund because the general fund only supports about 40% of the active payroll. So these liabilities and costs are substantial, but it's important to note that this was not always the case. When you go back 15 years before the Great Recession, both of these retirement systems were close to fully funded. VSERS was actually 100% funded in 2007. And the teacher system was in the mid to high 80% range right before the Great Recession. But since 2008, when the current amortization period started, future pension costs have grown faster than the pension assets have grown. And the costs have grown faster than the active payroll. As a result, the size of the gap between the asset and liability lines on the charts, which is the unfunded liability, has grown. That unfunded liability represents the debt that ultimately needs to be addressed by the end of the amortization period, which is 2038. It's important to note that this gap has grown despite the legislature fully funding its required payments into the pension system since 2007. But closing this growing gap will require higher AID Act payments in the future. Here you can see how steeply the pension payments have grown in recent years. The legislature has fully funded these growing AID Acts every year since the start of the amortization period, and in some years paid excess amounts. But the funded ratio has still declined year after year. The hole has gotten deeper, thereby requiring higher payments in future years to make up the difference. As these pension costs have increased substantially, those costs have primarily fallen on the employer to pay. Employee contribution rates have not increased in recent years, and neither has the size of the active workforce. But the cost to the employer has increased significantly because the employer currently assumes the full risk when assumptions change or are not met through experience. So if the systems miss their investment targets or their assumptions change, those additional costs all fall on the employer to pay by default. And again, I want to stress that these recent increases are not related in any way, shape, or form to anyone underfunding the pension systems because the employer has fully met its obligations every year during the amortization period. The chart on the right side focuses just on the normal cost, which is the amount you need to pay into the pension fund every year to fund the future year's worth of benefits that the workforce accrued that year. Employee contributions fund a portion of the normal cost. They do not pay down the unfunded liability, which is the employer's responsibility. But in recent years, that normal cost has grown due to changes in assumptions. And as a result, employee contributions now cover roughly half of the normal cost. The other half of that cost, plus the payment toward the unfunded liability, are paid by the employer through the annual AID Act payment. So if everyone has been paying in their required amounts, why have the unfunded liabilities grown so much since 2008? The top chart shows you the impacts on both systems since 2008 and includes the impacts of the Great Recession. And the bottom chart shows you just what's happened since FY11 to exclude the impacts of the Great Recession. At the top here, you could see how the VSER system was once fully funded. Its unfunded liability was negative $11 million in the beginning of 2008. The teacher system started the amortization period with an unfunded liability of roughly $275 million. A big reason why the teacher system had a higher starting unfunded liability was because the AID Act was fully funded by the employer during just 4 years between 1979 and 2006. And until 2014, teacher OPEB costs were paid out of the retirement system, which created additional unfunded liabilities. These things did not happen to the state employee system, but the AID Acts have been fully funded for both systems throughout this amortization period. But if you add your way down these columns, you can see here how changes to assumptions, such as changing the assumed rate of return and changing the demographic assumptions, investment experience falling short of the assumed rate of return, and demographic experience deviating from assumptions have all had on the growth of the unfunded liabilities over time. And to see just how big the impact of the Great Recession was, compare the investment experience totals in both charts. There are slides at the very end of this deck that break out these factors in greater detail, and that information was also included in the Treasurer's January 15th report and the most recent experience studies. But the key takeaway here is that most of this unfunded liability grew over the last 13 years due to changes in assumptions and experience, both in investments and the patterns of our workforce, deviating from those assumptions. So why did experience deviate from assumptions so much? Well, both systems have faced a lot of demographic changes right around the same time period that the funds were battered by the Great Recession. Both pension plans have matured quite a bit. The number of retirees drawing benefits out of the system increased by approximately 63% for the state employees and 77% for the teachers. Meanwhile, the size of the active workforce has not really grown on the state side, and it actually decreased on the teacher side. So overall, fewer people are paying in and more people are getting paid out retirement benefits. Benefit payments out of the systems have grown faster than member contributions. and now exceed payments made into the systems from the employer and members. This requires money to be taken out of the investment portfolio in order to fully fund benefits every year, which makes it harder to make up ground and close that unfunded liability gap. The average retirement benefit has also grown, and it's around $21,000 a year. But a lot of this growth is due to the fact that we've seen so many more retirees entering the system at higher average salary rates than people who have been in retirement for longer. Here we see this dynamic play out in a slightly different way. The systems have seen positive income every year since 2009 from employee and employer contributions and from investment returns, with the exception of the investment losses in those Great Recession years. You can see that with the green bar segments. However, the amount paid out in benefits, those red bars, has steadily increased too, as more people have retired over time. This combination, which you can see on these charts, really creates a headwind that slows the growth in the market value of assets from year to year and makes it harder for the systems to close the unfunded liability gaps through investment gains alone. If you want to improve the funding ratio of the plans and close that unfunded liability, you need your asset growth to not just be positive. You need it to be higher than the growth rate of the pension liabilities. In other words, your money needs to grow faster than your expenses are growing. And that just has not been happening in recent years. My final chart shows you the big picture and speaks to the cost of inaction. If nothing changes, pension costs to the state will keep increasing between now and the end of the amortization period in 2038 in order to dig out of the hole. We are looking at combined total AID Act payments for VSERS and the teacher system of roughly $316 million in FY22, which is far higher than it was just a few years ago. This amount will grow to approximately $500 million by the end of the amortization period. And that's assuming that the hole doesn't get any deeper. In other words, all assumptions must be consistently met between now and then, and the current assumptions wouldn't change to make the hole any deeper between now and then. But this is a status quo situation, assuming everything goes exactly as planned. And if we've learned anything from looking at the last decade, it should be that things rarely go exactly as planned. And there is always inherent risk that your costs will go up or down. So the AID Act payment will keep crowding out other budgetary pressures in the future in a status quo situation. And on top of that, failure to address the liabilities can also have negative impacts to the state's bond ratings, which can lead to additional fiscal pressures. When the rating agencies look at states, they consider things like their fiscal management, the economic fundamentals of the state, demographics, future growth projections, and the structural budgetary challenges facing the state and the ability of the state to respond to those challenges, as well as to respond to anything unforeseen that might come down the pike. Vermont has already had its ratings outlook downgraded due in part to its growing retirement liabilities. It takes decades of financial discipline to build and maintain a strong bond rating, and it can be lost very quickly, all of which should underline the importance of taking these liabilities seriously and ensuring that steps are taken to address them. So let's summarize everything on one slide. Since the Great Recession, the retirement liabilities have grown significantly, and they've grown much faster than the plan assets have grown. Demographic pressures have had a lot to do with this. We've seen a very large growth in the number of retirees and the size of their benefits, though the state's pension benefits on average remain relatively modest, again, around $21,000 a year. And this happened while the systems were trying to claw back from the impacts of the Great Recession. We've also seen the demographic experience of the workforce lead to higher than originally assumed costs. Changes were made to assumptions that will hopefully lower future risk to the plans, but they have also led to higher costs. As the number of retirees has grown, the systems are paying out more and more in benefits each year, more than employees and employers are contributing into the systems. And that requires assets to be pulled out of the portfolios to make up the difference. These factors all combine just to make it harder to dig out of that hole caused by the recession or to make progress toward paying down the unfunded liability. They also increase some risk to the employer from suddenly higher ADEC costs from year to year if your assumptions are missed or if the assumptions end up changing. Overly optimistic investment assumptions and failure to meet those assumptions consistently certainly contributed to the growth in unfunded liabilities, especially when you include the fact that the Great Recession occurred during this amortization period. Failure to consistently hit those assumptions, as well as lowering the assumptions for the future, both led to higher liabilities and ADAC costs. You hear a lot of people talk about the historic underfunding of the pensions, which mostly happened on the teacher side, along with the old practice of paying for OPEB, for the subsidized retiree healthcare out of the teacher retirement system. These factors did contribute to the cost of the ADAC and the fact that the teacher system had a lower funded ratio than the state system, which was fully funded at the start of the amortization period. But it did not lead to the enormous growth in liabilities from FY21 to FY22, or to the vast majority of the growth in the unfunded liability that happened since 2008, when the current amortization period started. Rather, that growth was mostly due to other factors like investment performance, demographic experience, and changes to assumptions. And like many other pension systems, the state systems lowered their assumed rate of return to 7% to more realistically match anticipated investment performance in the future. This might have the benefit of leading to less substantial deviations between experience and assumptions in the future, which would translate into lower risk of drastically higher ADAC payments from year to year. But this change certainly had a significant impact on increasing the unfunded liability and the ADAC payment from FY21 to FY22. And it also lowered the funding ratio for both plans because this change means the plans expect to earn less from investment gains in the future, thereby requiring higher employer payments to make up that difference. So as I promised, this is a much shorter slide deck than I typically offer on this subject. This can be like boiling the ocean if you try to take on too much. But if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them now. And you can also feel free to send me an email at your convenience. We can circulate this slide deck around afterwards, and there's a link here to the different presentations that are much longer that I've done on this subject that are on the JFO website.
Right.
But with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. And can you take your share? Oh, perfect. We circulated yesterday the links to all your three previous more in-depth presentations. Thank you for those. They're terrific. So we have about 20 minutes time for questions. And do I see who has a first question? Jane.
Well, I have a comment. Thank you, Chris. Because I do think a number of things are getting conflated, and it appears as though the legislature somehow has been irresponsible. And I just want to state, since 2007, we have been paying the ADAC in full for both teachers and for state employees. There was a period of time that people still think is occurring, and that is to differentiate the two reasons for underfunding. For teachers, the underfunding prior to 2007 was driven by decisions the legislature made not to pay the full recommended ARC or ADEC, as it was called. Since 2007, actually there was a committee, I think Jeb Spalding was treasurer at the time, Diane Snelling was on it, and they recommended amortizing that underfunding, which was about 275,000 million, I'm sorry. So we have been paying since 2007, the full employer required contribution plus payments on amortized payments on that underfunding. And then, but that which is past, making up for the past decisions. But I just want to reiterate what Chris is saying is underfunding also occurred, not because the legislature didn't pay the full amount. It occurred because of the assumptions that were used in calculating the ADEC, which had to do with demographics and it had to do with the return on investment. So underfunding was driven by two different things, but it's easy to put them together, and somehow the legislature failed to fulfill its fiscal obligations to pay the annual employer contribution. And I think it's there's a lot of reference to the past history and assuming that was still the case. And I just want to reiterate that was corrected and addressed in 2007. So some of us were like, well, we've been paying the full amount. You know, we feel like we're being responsible. We actually put in more money. why are we losing ground? And I think this presentation helps differentiate the two drivers at work here. So I just wanted to reiterate for those who might think that from a budget perspective, we were deliberately underfunding the annual contribution, that has not been the case since 2007, which is 15 years ago, I guess.
And if I may, Senator Kitchell, that's an excellent point. And just to maybe put an even finer point on that, I just want to clarify that, when the employer underfunds the ADAC, that doesn't mean that money just disappears into the ether. That the ADAC gets recalculated every year. So based on what happened in the prior year. So, an employer shorting the ADAC over time doesn't mean the money never shows up. It means you have to pay more with interest later in the amortization period through higher ADAC payments than you would otherwise need to make. So if there was no prior underfunding, the starting balance would have been, theoretically zero at the start of this, at the start of the amortization period in 2008. And if it was fully funded. So yeah, all of those historic practices of the past happened before, and it really did not contribute to the fact that that number went from 274 million to just shy of $2 billion today.
Yeah, no, so a next question. I see Thomas Chittenden, and then I see Bobby Starr. Thomas?
Chris, can you hear me? Chris, thank you for this presentation, really useful. Can you confirm, I heard you say multiple times that the employer currently bears all of the risk if we don't meet our expectations or our funding or our performance expectations. Isn't it also true though that the employer also benefits, similar to what you just said, if we overperform for 5 years straight, that will lower our ADAC, thus freeing up budgetary capacity and less pressures on the general fund. So we both bear the risk as well as the benefit should the market overperform. That is a true statement?
That's a very true statement, and that risk certainly cuts both ways. Risk could be at the risk. When we use that term in pensions, it's sort of speaking to the uncertainty of not knowing what your payment's going to be from year to year. So yeah, if you fall short of your assumptions, you're at risk of bearing a higher cost. If you have some banner years where your assumptions have been fully exceeded and things are going way better than you thought, that shows up in lower future ADAC payments. So the employer certainly would receive the benefit of that as well.
Thank you. I see Senator Starr and then Senator Hardy.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Very good presentation. A couple of questions. I was looking over the number of teachers that we employ, and I thought we were down less than maybe 100 from, just a couple of years ago, even though we're down a great number of students, that we're still pushing right around 10,000 teachers. So I was wondering about the numbers that you said we were down with the number of teachers, and if that's a legitimate number that I used.
That's a great question. I'm pulling up another slide deck right now. In 2008, we had 10,685 active teachers. 2020, we have 9,996 active teachers.
So, we haven't lost that many compared to the number of students that we've lost. And the other issue is, if the calculations are off, does the board do the calculating and setting that system up? And if that is true, I thought I saw in your presentation that there's three Vermont NEA people on that board, and if they don't have to make up any shortages and they're sitting on that board, why is there so many of them on the board if we, the taxpayers, have to make up the difference if it comes up short on financing?
That's a very fair question. That is more in the bailiwick of your colleagues to answer that than mine, because that's the way the statute is designed. I will say that nationwide, it's pretty common to have employee and employer trustees at the table making joint decisions over pension systems. Just to go back to the first part of your question about the assumptions, yeah, the actuaries, not the board members, the actuaries will crunch the numbers and actually say, hey, here's what happened in the last year. Whenever they do the valuation studies or when they do the experience studies, they'll go back further and offer some recommendations to the trustees about what to change, if anything. It is up to all these boards to concur on changes to the assumed rate of return. And I believe the individual trustee boards have to concur on or at the very least have to approve demographic assumption changes. But yes, you're absolutely right that with the adoption of all of these changes to assumptions, all of these boards of trustees, which are included both employees and employer reps, are involved in doing that.
Great. Thank you. I think, see Senator Hardy. And so Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Majority Leader. And thank you, Chris, for your great presentation. I've watched all of them and read all of them, so they're extremely helpful. And we're lucky to have you on board. My question, though, is for the pro tem about the process and sort of next steps and what all of recent activity means for the Senate. And I'm wondering if we're ready to talk about that or if there's more information forthcoming. Madam Majority Leader, if you know, or if Senator Ballant is.
If our pro tem isn't with us, I can certainly give you a notion. The House, we're doing this in steps, and the first step is really to address the governance issues, which Chris has addressed in this presentation. So what I believe we will see is a bill that comes to us that will address a governance and maybe redesign governance. Governance is what they're going to be focusing on, and also setting up a task force with all the stakeholders at the table to begin the work on making recommendations to us so that we can act next year on any additional changes that'll have to be made to the rest of what needs to be done to balance this, to right this ship.
Okay, so we will see a bill coming over from the House for our action.
That is the expectation, is that we will have that that addresses governance and sets up a task force to do the work of getting all the players at the table that will make recommendations to us for action that we can weigh next year. And if the pro tem has anything else to add, that's my understanding. And I think Senator Kitchell has something to add.
Okay.
The only thing I was going to add, and it hasn't to do with the legislation in the task force, but just to give you some idea of the impact of on the budget, the percentage of the general fund that is devoted to pensions now is 13%. That's 13 cents on every dollar. General fund dollar is going to pensions.
Yeah.
And so the budget for 22 has $215 million budgeted for this. So you can see what an impact it has in terms of funding for all the other programs and benefits of services. And on top of that, the ADEC has been revised for teachers. That's now paid out of the education fund, and that's an additional 38 million on top of the 250. So I just give that out as some sense of the proportionality of the expenditure for pensions and OPEB. It's both. I need to make it clear. It's for both the ADEC and the OPEB payments, but it is significant.
Great. Okay, I now see Senator Lyons, Senator Sears, and then Senator Rahm.
And Senator Mazza.
And Senator Mazza. Senator Lyons.
All right, thank you. Actually, my question goes to the question about the bond rating and how defensible at all are the issues that you have presented as the bond rating might be adjusted or considered. So can you just talk about that very briefly? And thank you, Chris.
Sure. So, generally the bond rating agencies will, They hate when people try to say what they're thinking without them saying it. So I'm going to try not to put words in anybody's mouths because this is live. But generally they look at a couple things. They'll look at what are your fundamentals as a state. How fast is your economy growing? What does your demographics look like? What does your fiscal management look like? Vermont tends to get pretty good marks on its financial management. What kind of reserves do you have in order to address any sort of unforeseen things that might come up? And what is your ability? How large are your fixed expenses and long-term liabilities? So that is an area relevant to pensions and OPEB that is of concern and of interest to rating agencies. Is you look at how big are your long-term liabilities, and what's your path forward to addressing them and paying them. And if you have a state that has extremely strong economic growth projections and really favorable demographics, that's going to adjust the calculus a little differently than a state that may have a smaller economy or a different demographic mix. And so it's hard to compare like us to California, for example. I could say that every state with a defined benefit pension system has been facing similar challenges since the Great Recession. And it's really that perfect storm of everybody got whacked by the market in 2008, right around the same time baby boomers were really entering retirement in very, very large numbers. So, on the one hand, you've lost a lot of money and it's hard to claw your way back out of that when more and more money is going out the gate to pay for benefits. So, if you go back 20 years, many state pension systems were very, very strongly funded, including, these two systems. But ever since then, we've seen it deteriorate. So, we're not out there on our own facing this. I think it's something the rating agencies look at everywhere. I think what they're really interested in is what's the path forward to resolving it. And that's what I think people are really going to be interested in seeing.
Great. Thank you. Senator Sears, and then Senator Rahm, and then Senator Mazza.
My question is pretty simple, and that's, at least to me, it's simple, is hopefully we can have a caucus when we get closer to seeing an actual bill from the other body. I'm afraid this thing's going to get rushed at the last minute, and the Senate won't get much of a voice there. And so I hope that we can, I thought the question about the schedule and the timing is an important one. I am really concerned. We're talking next week is the 15th of April, and if we're getting out of here in the middle of May, that gives us 5 weeks roughly to deal with this issue that's been hanging around us for quite a while. I'd hate to think that the Senate's going to get a last minute opportunity to have its voice heard.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that concern. Serving on Senate GovOps. Senator Rahm.
Thanks, Allison. Chris, kind of following up on the questions about where we are an outlier as a small state, I just feel like it's helpful to understand if we make changes, how that will affect our ability to attract teachers and state employees in Vermont vis-a-vis particularly other northeastern states, as well as just, I keep hearing that municipal retirement funds are far more solvent and stable. And I'm just wondering if they pool those funds differently. I do worry that, what we do does affect our ability to attract quality workers.
Yeah, those are great questions. Let me start with your last question first. The reason I haven't really talked about the VMERS system, the municipal system, is although their assets are invested through VPIC, just like the other systems, it's a very fundamentally different system. It's way less mature than the state and teacher systems are, meaning, they have way more actives to retirees. They have a much stronger funding ratio. They don't have, the legacy challenges that that the other two systems are. And right now, their unfunded liability is not particularly large, but it's not being paid for out of the state budget. It's paid for by participating employers. So that's a sort of separate creature in a way. And it's hard to it's kind of comparing apples to oranges. On your first question, I think it's absolutely valid that you need to consider any changes to our retirement system in the overall compensation context of the workforce. It can't just be viewed in isolation. It has to be viewed with salaries. It has to be viewed with, what are contribution rates for different benefit packages. And it has to be, viewed in the context of what's the cost of living, because, and who are we competing with? And, just what's the overall package, because all of these things impact things differently. And it's really, really difficult to look at one thing in isolation. You really need to look at sort of employee compensation holistically.
Right.
So I have a bunch of follow-up questions that I'll put in an email, and I'd love to start doing that with you, is comparing us to other states, because I'm getting information from constituents about comparisons that they look at all the time in places like New York and Massachusetts. And I think we need to be able to look at that.
That'd be great. And I've done some analysis that I can share with anybody who's interested. Another key thing to think is, some states folks don't participate in Social Security and other states do. So you need to adjust for that too. I could say, based on the research I've done, I would not characterize Vermont's existing benefit structures to be particularly generous. I would characterize them as modest, but my idea of modesty may differ with somebody else's, but you can, I think, objectively look at just a couple key variables about how your benefit structure is calculated and compare that. And the structure we have in place isn't the most generous out there by a long shot. Having said that, we still have a really big unfunded liability we need to figure out how to pay for and how to close.
Thank you. And I think our last question will come from Senator Mazza.
You mentioned, Chris, thank you very much. You mentioned that the employer has paid higher and higher every year, but the employee has not. Those rates have not gone up. Why is that? Why haven't the employee paid more?
So that's an excellent question. The employee rates are set in statute, and they're based on what sort of group you're in or what time you're when you were hired. So if I'm a newly hired teacher right now, I would pay 6% of my gross salary. So right now our employee rates are structured on a static basis. So the additional money that comes in from employee contributions, that amount only grows if the size of your workforce grows or if the size of your payroll grows.
And I guess the union doesn't understand that. I mean, they should be coming forward with a solution of participating in a little more money for the employee. That's strange that that's not happening. We'll never get out of this hole if we don't address it sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have 2 minutes. So actually we'll have a last question from Senator Pearson, did you just disappear?
Yeah, no, it's okay. I'll take it offline. Thanks.
Go for it. We have 2 minutes.
Well, to be honest, I've forgotten my question.
Okay. And then did Senator Sears have another question, or are we? No? Okay.
No, I didn't. I'm sorry. I kept my hand
okay.
up.
I could see the yellow hand. I could actually see it. I'm so blind. Chris, thank you. This was terrific. And
my pleasure.
We would appreciate the slide deck, this summary slide deck, which was great. I urge all of us to watch all three because they go in greater depth if you're interested, and we all need to be both interested and engaged on this because it's one of the biggest issues we're going to be dealing with in the next 2 years. So thank you very much. This was just great. See you all soon. Thanks. Thank you.